In this lesson, we're going to continue where we left off with our basic switch setup and talk about basic port configuration. We're going to complete a number of tasks as we set up these ports. The first one is we're going to configure a port for an end host. The second thing we're going to do is add a description to a port. Third thing we're going to do is actually enable the port or turn the port on. And then last but not least, we're going to show you some show commands on how to verify that your port is functioning properly. So let's take a look. Here we have our Nexus switch. Now, in order to configure a port, the first thing we need to do is go from our executive mode to our global configuration mode by typing configure terminal. We're now in our global configuration mode. From there, we want to go ahead and configure a port. So we want to say that we want to go into the interface, Ethernet 1/1. Now, I may or may not know what's configured on this interface, so I always like to do a show command to see the running config that is currently on this interface. So I'm going to do a show running config interface Ethernet 1/1. Now, as you can see, it shows me the configuration for my switch port. So I basically don't have anything configured on this port, and I want to go ahead, and the first thing I want to do is I want to tell the switch that I am going to use this as a switch port. The second thing I need to do is tell the switch that this switch port will have an end host connected to it. So I want to specify switch port mode access. This tells me that this is going to be an access port. The third thing I want to do is to actually add a description to this port, so I know what it is. Description server 1. Finally, I want to enable the port. So there are two modes that your port can be in. One is shutdown, where the port is actually shut down, and the second one is no shutdown, where we bring the port up, and that's what I'm going to do now. As soon as I enter these commands, they take effect. Now finally, now that I've configured my port, I want to go ahead and exit out of this configuration. If I press exit, I go back one level to the global configuration mode. If I press exit again, I go back all the way to the executive prompt. Now I'd like to display and make sure that I've configured my switch port properly. So I'm going to do a show running config interface Ethernet 1.1. And now I can see the configuration for my switch port. But hey, wait, where did all my configuration go? In this case, we're not seeing a lot of configuration under the port because the commands I entered in some case were default commands. The Nexus switch line does not show default commands in its running config. So all I see is the non-default command, which is description server 1. By default, this port is configured as an access port and it is enabled. So let's say I want to check the actual status of the port. I would go back show interface Ethernet 1/1. And now I can see that Ethernet 1.1 is up, and there's a description on the port of server 1. I can see the MAC address, I can see the hardware, and then I could also see if it was sending or receiving any frames. There's one more command I want to show you, and it's a very quick way to see all the interfaces on the device. It's called show interface brief. When I do a show interface brief, it shows me all the interfaces that are on the device and whether or not they were up or down, how they are configured, what type they are, and the speed. So it's a very useful command when you're going through and configuring your device. This concludes our lesson. Please join me for the next lesson, Describe VLANs.